So continuing on with the PvE builds today, the best intelligence ones, and honestly, I don't really got much to say, it's a bunch of magic stuff. The Darkmoon Greatsword did get nerfed a little bit as the DLC dropped, but it still is a very premium option in the game, and probably is still one of the best, if not the best, intelligence weapon too. Now this is a very high damaging frost magic based greatsword that actually can get free projectile attacks with its heavy upon using the skill, which is only roughly like 30 FP, and it just gives you a bunch more magic damage, some more frost buildup, and every single one of these heavy attacks will just be a nice damaging magic frost based projectile attack. Now this magic projectile, despite it being tied to the heavy attack, is still going to scale off things like the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon, and the fact that we have a high damaging projectile attack that doesn't consume any FP and that can work with all these different types of things and do as much damage as it does do, we don't really need to actually pair it alongside many different types of spells, but we still might as well benefit of some different types of things, most important one being Ranni's Darkmoon. This is going to be just a staple for every single intelligence build if you do have the requirements for it, because it does do a bunch of frost buildup and it debuffs enemies to make them take 20% more magic damage for a minute, and combined with this heavy attack already doing some frost buildup and is doing pure magic damage, obviously there's going to be a must-have. I do have Knight's Comet as this projectile does go a bit further, and it's good against enemies like to move around a bunch. And I do have Blazer Stone as a physical damaging option, and Shard Spiral for those larger types of bosses. And if you do go up against some types of enemies that just won't really move around as much, you could use things like Comet Azure Steel. Now, I obviously recommend pairing this alongside the Cerulean Hidden tier, but it is only a handful of bosses that can be useful with this type of spell. Now, being that it's such like an easy noob-friendly type of weapon, I'm going to pair it alongside things like the Dragon Crest Shield talismans and the Crimson Sea talisman too. These are the best talismans for survivability, and that has helped boost your neutral game by so much more, as it just means a whole bunch more healing and just more defenses. And I do also have the Magic tier and Opaline tier, which is just once again more damage and just more defenses. It's just a simple and easy to use build. The Wing of Astel is the best stance-breaking weapon in the entire game, and yes, it is a curved sword as well, which is just ridiculous, and it's purely because of things like its skill and its heavy attack. The skill in Nebula for only 20 FP does fire out this high-damaging magic AoE that has a bunch of these different explosions, and if all these explosions connect, you're doing well over 50 stance damage. And funnily enough, its heavy attack also does double down as a free projectile, which the damage can be okay, but at point-blank range, you hit with the weapon directly and the projectile attack, so the damage can be amazing, and also it does 43 stance damage with a charged heavy, which is just as much as some colossal weapons in this game. And pairing these two things in tandem, alongside things like the Shard of Alexander, you're just going to be destroying every single boss. Now, I do also have things like the Blade of Mercy and the Two-Handed Talisman, which is obviously really good for critical attacks. And the Two-Handed Talisman does just boost your heavy attack damage and your light attack damage by 15%. Now, if you are just in the base game and using the Wing of Astel, using things like the Axe Talisman and the Dagger Talisman are going to be good alternatives. I do also have the Millicent's Prosthesis for +5 dexterity, and it can be good for the multi-hits. Now, this weapon actually does benefits more by putting point into dexterity once you do reach around about 60 intelligence, but being that's the skill and the heavy attack does scale purely off intelligence, you're probably just better off going more into that stat. And you might notice that I do have a Misericord in the offhand, and that is purely just to get critical attacks. This thing gets 140 crit, and any single time that you get a stance break and switch to this weapon, you're getting so much more crit damage. And being that we are using like a magic infused Misericord, might as well just throw in things like Glint's Blade Phalanx. It doesn't do anywhere near as much stance damage as it once did, but it still is a little bit more. So before you actually do engage with an enemy, you could just use this Asher Wall beforehand. And obviously, being that we are going with an intelligence build, might as well use some spells. Even though the weapon is perfectly fine, you still want to have some like ranged-based options, and that's where Knight's Comet is going to come into play. I have Fleeting Microcosm as a range-based AoE attack, but the two most important spells will be Ranni's Darkmoon once again, and Zamora Ice Storm. Every single time you have an intelligence build, being able to proc Frost is like a must-have, because it does mean 10% damage, and it makes enemies take 20% more damage for the next 30 seconds. So it's like one of the best debuffs in the entire game, and Zamora Ice Storm can proc it in an instant, especially if you do lead off with Ranni's Darkmoon. And in the Crystal tier, we just have the Magic and the Opaline tier for more damage and damage negation, but yeah, the entire playstyle is just spamming the skill and spamming the heavy attacks, and just proccing stance breaks on basically everything. The Moonveil Katana is one of many different broken intelligence dexterity options in this game, and the reason being is not only because it gets really good scalings, but it's a katana that gets a projectile version of Unsheath, which Unsheath is already one of the best skills in the game, and yes, having like a magic infused Uchi Katana can do more damage than the Moonveil Katana, but the projectile portion is so utterly broken it goes ridiculously far, and when paired alongside things like the Shard of Alexander, and now the Rolana's Cameo, which as of its recent buff, does actually add 45% more damage upon charging it for a second, it can destroy everything so incredibly easily. Now, typically when it comes to the Rellana cameo build, you might still benefit more of just like constantly spamming it over and over again, instead of having to wait a second for it to charge up. But Moonveil isn't really that cheap, so having the efficiency is obviously going to be really nice. And in some cases, you're only going to have the opening for one attack anyway, so it's just always better to just have the Rellana's cameo on, especially if you are at a distance, because you can just safely charge it up in cover or further away from an enemy, and it's hit them with a buffed up version of Transient Moonlight. So being how quick and easy and safe this weapon actually is to use, might as well throw in things like the Magic Scorpion Charm, which yes does make you take a bit more damage. So if this is a big deal for you, I'd put on something for survivability like the Dragon Crest Shield Talisman or the Crimson Sea Talisman. But we also do have the Millicent's Prosthesis, which is just a bit more dexterity and just more damage with successive attacks. I do also have a dagger in my back pocket infused with Golden Bell to use before every single boss fight. Also have the Rakshasa set equipped because every single build just benefits of using this armor set. It's just free damage basically. And I do also have the Snow Witch hat, which gives us 10% more damage to my cold-based sorceries, which we're obviously going to be using some spells with the amount of intelligence that we have spec'd into, alongside the Carrion Regal Scepter. And obviously the most important spells, Rani's Dark Winds, the more Ice Storm, use them to debuff enemies and proc Frost. It's amazing to have for every single boss fight. And that does have things like Blades of Stone for a physical option and Shard Spiral against those larger bosses. But for the most part, you're just going to be spamming the skill over and over again, because the Moonveil skill is probably better than any spell out there. The Death Poker is yet again another dexterity intelligence based weapon that actually has one of the hardest hitting skills in the entire game. Like this thing can proc Frost faster than anything else and it's do ridiculous damage, as it does summon this Ghost Flame Ball and has the option of going into a Ghost Flame Trail attack or a Big Explosion. Now the Big Explosion I don't typically really care for as much. It's good at like sending some smaller enemies flying or just doing max damage in one hit, but the Trail effect is just insane. It can just do ridiculous amounts of status buildup and there's so much DPS, and you can just keep spamming it over and over again and have a bunch of different fire trails active at the same time. Now there are some downsides of the Death Poker. One, it doesn't really get the highest amount of AR, as its scalings aren't the best, only gets a descaling in intelligence. And unfortunately the skill does scale purely off intelligence, so you're kind of picking and choosing between like really good skill damage or really good weapon damage. And the weapon is like nothing special, just a random standard damaging greatsword with a basic moveset. Does get like a lunging heavy attack, but its heavy attack does like twice as less stance damage than every other charged heavy attack that the greatswords get, so I just don't really like the weapon itself. And with this build we're only going to be using it for its skill, because our main primary melee option is going to be Carrion Slicer. The existence of Carrion Slicer means you don't really need to use any weapon at all, because this thing is incredibly cheap and it can just output higher DPS than like most weapons in the game. So yeah, the entire build is just spamming the skill at the beginning of the fight, proccing Frost in an instant, and in any single instance to where you don't have the opening to use the Death Poker attack, just use Carrion Slicer. We are going to have the Carrion Glintblade staff in the offhand, because this staff actually does add 15% more damage to Carrion Slicer. So you're going to have this one equipped while you're just using the Lusat staff, which is our main primary option, to just maximize the damage. Now yes, Lusat staff does actually make you take 50% more FP, but with how cheap Carrion Slicer is, we can literally afford to use this, and we do have 35 Mind with this build as well. Now you can use some other spells if you wanted to. You can have things like Knight's Combat if you wanted to have like more of a ranged option. Once again, just having things like Blades of Stone for like a physical option, as I think is the best one, and Fleeting Microcosm as like a ranged AoE. Not really that necessary, but you might as well have them equipped. And obviously once again, Rani's Dark Wind, you just lead off the boss fight with this. It's a nice solid debuff. And as for the talismans, obviously the Shard of Alexander, we have the Millicent's Prosthesis, which yes, Carrion Slicer actually does work with the multi-hit talismans. Doesn't really work as well. Takes like a whole bunch of hits just to be able to proc it the first time, but you still can't go wrong with it, as it does add a little bit more dexterity as well, which is nice for our casting speed. And if you actually wanted to use the Death Poker too, we have the Graven Mass Talisman for more spell damage, and the Magic Scorpion Charm, which also gives us a bunch more magic damage, but does actually make us take a bit more physical damage in return. So if you were noticing that you were taking a little bit too much damage, you could just switch this one off for the Crimson Sea Talisman or the Dragon Crest Talisman. And in our crystal tiers, we do have the Magic tier and the Intelligence tier just to maximize damage. But once you actually have reached the soft caps of 80 intelligence, you can switch off the Intelligence tier for like the Opaline tier instead. So for the last build, I wasn't really too sure whether to go with a Carrion Sovereignty build or a Glintstone Crisp build, so I just decided to say fuck it and just combine them both into one build, because they both kind of complement each other nicely, as one is actually going to be like a really hard hitting type of attack, really high stance damage, but it does have like a longer animation, so it can be a bit situational in some areas, whereas Glintstone Crisp skill in Glintstone Dart is actually one of the highest damaging projectile attacks in the game. Like this thing can just do more damage than things like Comet and Knight's Comet for only 10 FP. Now it can't be spammed over and over again like Knight's Comet or regular Comet, but with how much damage it does do and how efficient it is, it does make for a very broken option. So we're just going to power stance a couple of daggers, which I typically don't really care much for the moveset, as I kind of see them a bit outclassed by things like claws, but it's still going to be perfectly viable, and we can just utilize two of the most broken Ashes of War in the game. Any single time you get a longer opening or you're fighting like some smaller types of knights and whatnot, I would just use things like Carrion Sovereignty, which yes, with a great sword, you actually can get hyper armor, whereas with a dagger, you don't. But with this build, we do have a lot of endurance, and we are going to be using lighter weapons, so we can pair it alongside heavier armor and get a whole bunch of poise so we can trade out with enemies. Now, whether or not you put it with a greatsword to have like a certain amount of poise, you're still not going to be able to tank attacks from larger types of bosses, but at least this way it's still going to be somewhat less frustrating. And with how much stance damage Carrion Sovereignty does do, with the entire combo is like over 90 stance damage, we're going to benefit of putting it with the Misericord, because when you do get a stance break, the Misericord is going to get more critical damage than any other weapon in the game. And conveniently enough, both of these skills actually do get boosted by things like the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon, which is very nice. Gonna slap on things like the Magic Scorpion Charm as well, but once again, if you notice you're taking too much damage, you can switch it up for something else. And we do have the Millicent's Prosthesis, which is +5 to your dexterity, and it also gives you bonus damage on successive attacks. Now, as for our spells, alongside the Carrion Regal Scepter, once again, Rani's Dark Moon is the more Ice Storm. Really good debuff, also does procs Frost, which both of us gonna result in really nice debuffing. Also, Blades of Stone as a physical based option, and I do have Loretta's Great Bow as well, which yes, Loretta's Mastery can do more damage, but that one's way too inconsistent, and it consumes so much more FP and doesn't really do that much more damage, so I'd just rather have things like Loretta's Great Bow, because unfortunately the Glintstone Chris skill doesn't really go that far, so sometimes you actually want to hit something at a further distance, and that's where Loretta's Great Bow could come into play. And obviously things like Terra Magica as well. You could set this up in a safer spot before you fight a boss, and being that Carrion Sovereignty doesn't really involve you having to move around a whole bunch, you have to stay in like one particular spot, it is going to result in a bunch more damage. And as always, in the Crystal tier, we have the Magic tier and the Opaline tier just for some more damage and damage negation. Okay, that's now done. If you do have any questions about the builds in particular, if you're confused about something, just let me know down in the comments below and I will actually get back to you. Now, as for the next build video, it's going to be the faith-based build. Now, before then, I'm probably going to talk about the crystal tiers and rank all of those first. So if any of that does interest you, please do subscribe, and I'll catch you guys around. See ya!